Welcome back again. You're watching World Talks and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. While Russia continues to wage war against Ukraine, the country seems to be making a comeback in the world of sports and culture. The question now remains, why? Why would cultural and sports institutions allow Russia back into the fold? Here to discuss this, Sergei Erofeev, sociologist from the Rutgers University, joins me on World Talks. Good evening and thank you for joining us here.
Good evening, Klaudia. Thanks for having me.
So why do you think that we see a growing presence of Russian athletes and artists across different events and competitions, when previously these very organizations and institutions banned Russian artists and athletes in the first place?
Well, let's remember that the breaking out of this war was such a shock that it, first of all, provoked a moral response. At that time, introducing sanctions was not very clear in the sense how effective they were going to be. But some kind of moral response was needed in order to maintain the European moral integrity, to keep the European values alive. That's the origin of the sanctions, although sociologically speaking, there are always two sides to certain political actions. There are things which are emotional and moral, and we call that, associate that with expressive function. But at the same time, groups, agencies, institutions, they have instrumental approach. So in the end, we see that sanctions have played a very important role in minimizing the harm that Putin's regime is causing to Ukraine and maximizing the costs of this war for him. So what these cultural and athletic institutions have done was just following that moral signal and moral impetus in general. But with time, they discover, these associations and leagues, etc., that they are quite independent. While the national governments and the European Union still maintain quite a serious, tough stance against Putin's aggression, those associations are seeking certain benefits, and they know that the Russian participation in, let's say, Olympics can bring certain benefits to some people. And this even without mentioning a certain tradition of corruption in the same Olympic Committee or FIFA, which have shown their vulnerability before authoritarian regimes who want to use international events as their symbolic benefits. So depriving these authoritarian governments symbolic benefits is still a major task of serious political organizations such as the European Union. But if you talk about some athletic associations, they are independent from them. So this is the reason that they may deviate from this general line. Mm-hmm. And this happens all the time.
But this is precisely my point. So on one hand, we have what's moral, and on the other hand, we have the money and the influence. So why institutions that are supposed to uphold certain values, they're supposed to uphold certain standards, moral standards when it comes to societies, would take a step back and allow Russia back in?
Well, they find all kinds of justifications for that. First of all, they can argue in similar humanistic terms that we shouldn't punish honest athletes who want to be represented on the world arena. And this is the justification which contradicts the policies we just mentioned. But they sound very humanistic. We want those Russians not to die as career people and find some way of contributing to the world excellence in sport. So they find all these justifications, but the trap here is that it's very hard to find balance between collective or institutional action against an aggressor state and at the same time see the problems of individuals. This is a costly thing. So if you want to governments, associations, and every social actor, group actor in the West, in the democratic West, to constantly distinguish between the state who is the aggressor and discriminate that behavior with the behavior of ordinary people, most of whom may be just honest, simple people. This is a very costly thing, to be constantly involved in that kind of discrimination. We simply don't have those resources. So they take an easy way, find easy solutions how to pursue their instrumental benefits, like increasing revenue from sporting events, for example, and how at the same time remain morally more or less clean.
So we've heard about the decision of the European Commission to take steps to slash EU funding for the Venice Biennale. European Commission Vice President said on Saturday that the body has officially recommended that EU agency responsible for the funding of the Venice Biennale cut 2 million euros in funding. Do you think that this is actually going to bring the change? Is the wallet and the influence on thereof enough to be able to speak to those cultural independent institutions to remove that Russian influence?
That's a very good question, Klaudia. We very often, looking from the moral perspective, we very often underestimate the efficiency of instrumental action, which is very often reduced to financial, positive or negative incentive. What the European Committee can do, they can just deprive those independent associations and institutions of their support. But they will continue to act as they act if they can afford that. But in this case, the European Commission stays on the same firm moral grounds while showing that they have some resources of positive or negative influence through financing. But talking about positive things, what the West could do, and this hasn't been discussed enough, I'm afraid, alongside sanctions and punishment, certain measures could be taken to support those who want to make an exit from the Putin system. Let's imagine in 2022, the young figure skaters in Russia without whom the world of figure skating is significantly impoverished. If they could only take that step of exit from Putin's system and take athletic citizenship of some other country, that would be a very, very significant step in order to diminish the cultural power and the symbolic benefits for Putin and therefore for his war. But of course, they were practically children. They couldn't make such a step. But if we talk about those who are more mature people and could display some dissent, or just be neutral and not support the national flag of the aggressor, they could be offered certain channels of exit, changing their athletic nationality included.
Sorry to interrupt you, but that is also going to be very challenging, because when we think about sports competitions as such, there is an underlying idea that you represent something. You represent a certain set of values, a certain nationality, a certain culture. Your work is a direct reflection of the nation that you're representing. So wouldn't it be hard for these athletes to have to take on a different flag, take on another sort of an identity, so to speak, and then just to be able to showcase their sports and sportsmanship and athleticism?
That's a very good question, but we know that this has happened and happens from time to time. Even a South Korean athlete in the Winter Olympics changed his flag from South Korea to Russia, and these things do happen. And from the personal point of view, personal expression, not state representation, but individual participation, for many athletes, it doesn't matter that much under which flag they compete. But from the point of view of our humanistic European values in general, global humanistic values, we have to remember one framework. The Olympic Games were introduced as a part of modernization. of the Western world first and then the rest of the world, because they embody the spirit of cosmopolitanism, humanism, fair competition, achievements, looking into the future. But through the course of the 20th century and continues still now, many dictatorships use this modernization instrument to strengthen their anti-modern, their traditionalist values and systems. This has happened many times. We have seen how the International Olympic Committee acted very often in favor of those who act anti-humanistically. So it's a contradiction. So we are caught here between our desire to keep up those values of which we were talking. But the national flag, it's something which should be considered of secondary importance if we really want international humanism to prevail and the sports world to help it. We eventually could dream of the situation. And that was actually the original idea of the Olympics, when athletes compete not for the flag, not for the regime, not for a system, but they compete as free individuals representing exactly the values of humanism and progress for the entire world.
There is also a different perspective there, because in one of the latest developments, we've learned that the International Olympic Committee has lifted the suspension of the Russian Olympic Committee, clearing the path for Russian athletes to compete in the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics. How do you think this makes the Ukrainian athletes feel, many of which actually had to get to the front line themselves because of the acts of aggression orchestrated by Russia?
Their voice should be heard, and it should be loud, because that way they're deprived of more than these Russians are empowered with. So this is a huge deprivation. These athletes should find sufficient institutional support in the West. But, as I said, those athletic associations can be too independent sometimes, and sometimes too corrupt. We know what happened recently with FIFA head Infantino and President Trump. And similar things can happen when certain traditionalist and anti-progressive political force can push in favor of their symbolic benefits, let's say through the Olympic Games in Los Angeles. So they want to act as traditionalist brutal force acts, ignoring democratic and humanistic values. So they, therefore, directly or indirectly, financially or not financially, corrupt these structures and these institutions, which create the possibility for Putin's game yet another time, because Putin is a cunning master of cognitive wars. He would just pretend that he excludes those occupied territories from the Russian Olympic movement. And his, as Vladimir Lenin would say, useful idiots in the West would use it as an excuse for their current actions.
Sergei, thank you so much for joining me. An absolutely fascinating conversation, and I think one that we could have for a much longer time. Unfortunately, our time here is over. Sergei Erofeev, sociologist at the Rutgers University, was my guest. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And so this would be all for now here on World Talks. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska, and I really do hope to see you back here on TVP World, because we have more of this where it came from. So have a good one, and I'll see you soon.